today I am going to tell you things that you know. There will be no secret meaning expounded from the text this morning. No hidden nuggets of insight that you will have missed. Instead, I'm going to tell you a story. We're going to set this passage in the context that it comes and tell you why this is important today. Because on the face of it, this is a story for the law-abiding Jews of the Old Testament. They were told to commit to a sequence of festivals where they had to do things in ritual places for ritual reasons. And generally speaking, we don't do that anymore. The church is not bound by these things. And often what this leads to in churches is a dismissal of, and I don't mean sort of being critical and saying, oh, this is all rubbish, but a sort of a glossing over of these passages and why they were important. So I'm going to remind you today why this is important. The application point of this sermon is not going to be, you need to recommit yourselves to lots of sevens and appearing in a particular place for particular reasons. But there is some significant things that we need to be wary of here. But so, first of all, a bit of storytelling, though. I need to remind you that this takes place immediately after Israel has been captive in Egypt. So the backdrop for these stories is that the people have been slaves. They have been slaves who have been bound to the customs, tradition, and rules of the empire of Egypt. And God frees them from this. And a thing that is so easily missed in these stories. God frees them and he gives them the law on Mount Sinai. It starts with the 10 Commandments, and then there's a whole lot of other stuff that is less well known in churches. But the idea is that God says, you are now going to be the people that I promised to Abraham and to all of the people before Moses. But your distinctiveness isn't something you have to find for yourself. God could have brought them out of Egypt through the Red Sea and left them to it in some ways. He could have let their society develop in a natural and sort of spontaneous way. We see this is how the other nations around Israel in the ancient history evolve. We see that they do what is right in their own eyes. Some of them build amazing empires. Some of them do good things. More of them do bad things. God says to Israel, though, you are going to look distinctive among the nations. Imagine Israel, God says, that there was an outside observer who could see all of the nations and compare them to each other. They will see them doing their own things, living their own ways, but in you, Israel, you are going to look different from everybody else. I put it to you this morning that while the means by which you look different is different today, God's will that his people, which is you if you're a Christian, look different from the world is still the case. It is still important that you are distinctive from the rest of the world. Don't mishear that. You will not look better all of the time. Plainly look at the church in the world. You will see some parts of the church that are doing God's will in amazing places, doing amazing things, good work, humble service. And you will also see some churches who in the name of God are doing the opposite of that, who are selfish, who are greedy, who are doing their own thing. Christians do not own a monopoly on doing good, but as a general rule, a Christian should look different from the rest of the world. That's what this passage is about, I put it to you. There are 3 different festivals being celebrated here. Tabernacles, Weeks, and Passover. Or they sometimes have different names depending on what translations you have. And none of those 3 names are what they're actually called in Hebrew. But the point was that they were commanded to very specifically and very intentionally give thanks, commit themselves to service, and to work against the injustice in their town. If you can just put up some of the, I think it's about verse 12, back up for me if you can. I think it's verse 12. It's the one that talks about orphans and widows. There are 2 of them because the Old Testament likes to repeat itself. But find one of the ones that's, there you go. It says, there's a reason sons, daughters, male and female servants, sometimes slaves in your Bible. This does mean indentured workers as well as servants who are sort of, for want of a better word, employees of the master. It's meant to cover all. Servants is a bit more nicely sanitized for us, but slaves equally works. Foreigners, widows, these are the vulnerable people in society, and they are remembered in these times. And so God tells his people that part of their yearly cycle, they must intentionally put aside time to remember and address these things. Now, think about that for a moment, what that might look like if we tried to do it today. This is Harvest Sunday. This is 1.5 to 2 hours we put aside on one Sunday in the year to be thankful specifically about food and harvest and wider things. And this is good. Don't get me wrong, it is good that we remember this. We have other festivals in our year, but they often get reduced to a single morning or a single day. Christmas might perhaps be an obvious exception to this. Christmas tends to cover a couple more days where we are thankful and we think of our neighbor and we think of charity a lot more. If you ever read any of the statistics, you'll know that charity giving goes up massively more at Christmas than at any other time of the year. And that's true in churches as well as in true of society at large. But the point is that here in the Old Testament, they were told put aside a week. Not only once, but several weeks in the year. And it wasn't just put aside an entire week. It was go to a specific place. This is a time before cars, before transport that wasn't riding on a horse. And generally, horses and donkeys in this time, if they weren't being used by military forces to pull chariots or for cavalry, they'd have been used to haul stuff along. It was very unlikely, unless you were very rich, that you were riding the horse. The horse was there to pull stuff along, not for you to ride. So they were commanded for 3 weeks out of the year to massively inconvenience themselves. And it says, men go, send your men to the place I have chosen. Incidentally, the place being Jerusalem, even though it's not called that here. That's where they would go. And that's where many Jews still go today to celebrate these festivals. And when it says men, it doesn't mean that they left the women and children at home necessarily. As the men, it meant your household. So frequently they were dragging everybody with them. This had two really significant effects. The first is it disrupts anything approaching a rhythm of life at home. Imagine if you who are working currently, if you have a full-time job, imagine that as part of your religious commitments to church, you have to give up 3 weeks of your year where you have to drop everything you're doing, take your valuable holiday, and not only that, go somewhere where you'd much prefer not to go, where it's going to be really busy, really expensive, and a real pain in the butt getting there. Dunchurch Baptist Church, in a couple of weeks' time, I want you to take a week off work and walk to Stoke. It's not an appealing prospect, is it? And you would rightly rail against me for expecting that of you. This was expected of them. Slightly different times, so it's unfair to say it's the same thing now, but you get the idea. The point is, it was meant to inconvenience them. It was meant to be hard work because it was meant to remind them in their bodies and in their tired effort what it was they were doing. And the second thing I want to remind you is that there is a connection here between thankfulness for the things that you're given. So one of the festivals is where they would take in the harvest, and the first 10th of it, no matter how big their harvest was, the 10th of a meager harvest, the 10th of a massive harvest, and they had to give that, the best of it, to God, give it to the temple, and it would be distributed to people who needed it. The point was that they recognized that what they had was not theirs to keep and do with what they will, but it was God giving it to them, and they had to use it responsibly. So they gave some of it back. And because of this, the other festival about focusing on widows, orphans, slaves, things like this, you may have heard the word Jubilee a lot recently. Jubilee is the writing off of debts, the releasing of people who are in servitude. This was something that happened every 7 years and every 70 years. And every 70 times 7 years, there's a a lovely parallel that actually, when Daniel talks about the Jubilee of Jubilees, 70 times 7, that this idea of liberation and the relieving from debts. Anybody for a gold star, what happens 70 times 7 years after Daniel? Jesus is born. That there's this pattern of sevens and jubilees and jubilee of jubilees and things in the Bible. And you cannot separate justice from thanksgiving for food. What does this mean for us today that we've largely forgotten in our churches? It means that celebrating thankfulness for things like this must come hand in hand with trying as much as we can to rectify the injustice of food poverty in our country. Israel was commanded, give up the food that was never yours but was God's, and it will be distributed to those who need it, because God loves it when you're thankful, but he loves it more when you're just. So I don't know whether this is going to go to a food bank. I would imagine it is. But I want you to think very carefully about that when you go home. Have you given a fair share of what you have to those who need it this Thanksgiving harvest time? That's for you to judge. Maybe you have. I know that I haven't. We have not bought very much with us this morning. We will give more. And it doesn't just mean items of food. It's everything about your being. Part of these festivals that we read at the beginning of Deuteronomy, it is not simply about their physical wealth, their food, and their comfort. It is also about their time. How much time do you give up working for justice? However you think that might be in your life. I don't want to tell you what working for justice is, because you might know it better in your life than I do. But we have here, God's clear plan is that if Christians do this, they're going to look different. I want to encourage you now, because that was a bit of a challenge. The encouragement is, did you know that something like 90%, it's over 80%, high 80s, I think, percentage of food banks in this country are run by churches or other religious institutions, but it's overwhelmingly churches. Almost all debt relief charity was born out of churches or Christians working for things. Almost all these centers for justice and equality that have been around for a long time were born out of these sorts of things. Some of the major Christian denominations in this country were born out of activism on the streets, whether that's the Methodists or perhaps more famously the Salvation Army and their work against alcoholism and how that was ruining things. They looked at this and said, this is a problem that God hates that we can help solve. The entire Salvation Army movement was born on the premise that Christians should be getting down and dirty with helping solve these problems. We've forgotten that a little bit, I think, as Christians today. And so I could waffle about this for ages, and so I'll spare you any more. But I want to encourage you this morning that when you think of all of these laws in the Old Testament, when you think of all of these festivals and you go, we don't do that anymore, I want to say that perhaps we should. We should put more time aside for linking justice and thanksgiving. We should put more time aside to intentionally think carefully about how, as churches, we're responding to these issues, and crucially, how outsiders, and I use that word carefully, people who are not part of the church, would look at us and see what they are doing. This is difficult, and I might upset you by saying this, but it's possible there are people in Dunchurch who are looking at your lovely new building, and they don't see the other good work that you're doing, that I know you're doing. They just see, goodness me, hasn't the church got a lot of money? It's built itself a lovely new building. How might you tell or communicate to the church, to the community you're in, that actually this building fundamentally is for them? It's to serve them. It's a place in which we come to worship a God who wants to meet them. We need to be careful about how the church is seen. If we're seen to be opulent and living lives of luxury, even if we're not, and to be clear, I'm not accusing you of, like Habakkuk, paneling your house while the temple lies in ruins. But if that's how people perceive you, you should work to stop that. Be out there. Know that you're distinctive. People should think of the church as a place that is there to be humble, to be down where they are, to meet people where they need to be. And the third and final point this morning, yeah, we've got time, is just to link this to the video, which otherwise feels like I just showed you a sort of a slightly token video, is this extends beyond Dunchurch. It extends beyond this country. Christians are very good at working around the world. Most charitable aid organizations were founded by churches or church movements. The biggest ones, like BMS, existed when nothing else like this existed, other than colonial enterprise. We're not going to talk about that this morning. But the whole principle is that justice doesn't know borders. Thanksgiving and those who are in need do not go beyond our borders. And it's do go beyond our borders. And it's difficult to find the balance of this. Granted, I'm telling you this as if they've all got easy answers. They haven't. The job of a church, the job of a Baptist church specifically with your church meeting, is to discuss together what some of the answers to these questions might be. So next time you have a church meeting, this is a tangent, next time you have a church meeting and you're there thinking, goodness me, there's a lot of procedural nonsense we've got to sort out and ratify all of these things. And I'm not saying that Dunchurch's meetings are all bureaucratic like that, but the point is to discern the will of God together, and it shouldn't just be about bureaucracy and ticking the boxes of things. I challenge you to put something about how are we going to respond to the energy crisis this winter on your church meeting agenda, so that when you gather together as a body of Christians here, you talk about that, as well as fundraising, as well as your ministerial search. It should feature in your prayers as well, as part of your prayer life. And I'm sure it probably does, so I'm sort of lecturing the crowd. Anyway, this is an aside, and I apologize. I didn't mean to tell you what to do at a church meeting. The point is that we are connected to a story much bigger than ourselves. For us here, thinking about this place, this town, this county is relatively easy. We know our neighbours. We know our village relatively well. Or if we don't, we should. We don't know the places that we've seen on the screens, apart from through the eyes of other Christians who are there. And BMS every year asks, can you support these things? Note that they're not asking to build churches, were they? There was nothing in those videos that said, give us some money so we can build a church. Give us some money so we can afford a minister for these people who have given their lives to Jesus. No, it was, can we help them have food to survive? Can we help provide them toilets? Can we help provide them this stuff? We don't need grandiose ideas that come later. It's about solving people's needs in the imminent future. And if we do that, if we do this, as Israel, incidentally, spoiler alert, they repeatedly fail to do it. Sometimes they get it right, but often God is rebuking them in history for their failure to remember the widows and orphans. Like, if you don't know if you've ever sat down and read any of the prophetic books through, so often the prophetic books are, hello everybody, this is a paraphrase, hello everybody, there are some things you're doing exceptionally well, but you have forgotten extremely long list. Because of this, God is going to punish / rebuke / do something else. End with, but one day, this will be much easier for you. And we are living in that one day things should be much easier for you, because if you're thinking this is going to be really hard, and you're right to think that, we have got a helper, haven't we? We have got an intercessor in heaven, standing next to God, who is God, saying, these are my people. I will assist them. We have the Spirit working among us, who can do, lest we forget, impossible things in people's lives. None of these festivals specifically mention it, but when we get to the New Testament, we see when Jesus and the disciples are walking around, often the miraculous healings and things that happen that are huge and public displays of God at work happen at festival time, because people are focused on a particular thing. If we commit as churches to being focused on a particular issue, then God meets us in the midst of that, and sometimes amazing things happen. People get healed. It's very rare, if you've been part of a church for a long time, that in a regular service, God just miraculously heals someone. doesn't often happen. No one's expected. It does happen sometimes, but it's not often. Sometimes, though, I bet when you've been to a service where we've said, we want to see God heal someone here, and someone prays about it, and the church commits to praying about it, it's much more likely that God will move. Why do we know this and understand this logic for things like healing, but we fail to apply it to things like hunger or money? If we're intentional about things, God responds to that by being intentional with us. More often than not. God loves breaking these rules. And sometimes God just moves and you get caught up in the flow of it. That's good. But it should be a partnership. That is the great privilege of what we do as Christians in church. We get to partner with God's mission. I'll just end with that thought, because otherwise I could talk for ages. If you ever hear the phrase, the mission of God, there is two different schools of thought on what this means. One is that God has a mission, and it's our responsibility to do it. The mission is a task that we have to do. This is historically the one that's been most commonly understood. But recently, in the last few decades, there's been a complete switch of this understanding, that the mission of God is something God is doing, and it is the responsibility of Christians to get on board. And so this is your challenge today. What is God doing that you can get on board with, and how will that make you look distinctive in the community you're in? If it will. And if you can think of answers to those questions, do it.